October 14th, 1887. The ambient air temperature in Spearfish Valley, Dakota Territory, hovered at a deceptive 42 degrees. The wind, sweeping down from the Black Hills at a steady 18 miles per hour, carried the distinct metallic scent of an early frost. To the casual observer passing by on the heavily rutted territorial road, the sight must have seemed utterly pathetic. There, waist-deep in a rectangular pit of dense, unyielding glacial till and heavy clay, was Elara Sterling. She was 34 years old, covered in a fine layer of gray dust, her hands blistered from the relentless friction of a splintering hickory spade handle. She was not digging a well. She was not digging a root cellar for potatoes. She was, according to the raucous laughter of the wagon drivers passing by, digging her own grave.
Help me, Elara.
Elara was attempting to build a cabin, but instead of laying down a standard shallow foundation of fieldstone and immediately framing her walls to beat the coming snows, she was excavating a massive 6-foot-deep trench directly beneath where her floorboards were meant to go. "Look at the widow Sterling," a voice bellowed from a passing buckboard, the sound carrying easily over the prairie grass. "Building a basement for the prairie dogs. She'll be frozen solid by Thanksgiving." Elara did not stop digging. She didn't even look up to acknowledge the mockery. She simply drove the steel blade of the spade back into the earth, leveraging her weight to break through a layer of stubborn limestone gravel. She knew something they didn't. She understood the brutal arithmetic of the frontier. Out here, nature doesn't care about your pride, and physics is the only judge that matters. To understand why Elara was committing to such backbreaking, seemingly irrational labor, you have to look at the exact mathematics of her survival. Just 3 months prior, Elara's husband, Arthur, had succumbed to a rapid, violent bout of pneumonia. The frontier was not kind to weakened lungs, and the damp, drafty sod house they had temporarily occupied during the spring rains had sealed his fate. When the undertaker and the local physician had finally been paid, Elara was left standing on 160 acres of unimproved homestead claim with exactly 1865 to her name. In 1887, 1865 was a terrifyingly precise measurement of mortality. A single 196-pound barrel of flour cost $3.15. A 100-pound sack of beans was $2.40. 10 pounds of coffee to stave off the winter lethargy would drain another $1.50. Basic iron nails, essential for the 1416-foot timber-framed cabin she was required by law to build to prove up her claim, cost $1.10 per keg. If she failed to build a habitable structure and survive the winter on the land, the federal land office would revoke her claim. The local bank, which held a small lien on their draft horse, would repossess her only means of heavy labor. She would be utterly destitute, a widow cast out into the freezing streets of Deadwood or Cheyenne. She could not afford a traditional builder. She could not afford the premium, kiln-dried lumber imported from the eastern mills. And most importantly, she could not afford to heat her home the way the wealthy ranchers did. In the late 19th century, the standard operating procedure for frontier heating was fundamentally flawed, a dangerous compromise born of habit rather than engineering. Settlers would harvest bur oak, cottonwood, or ponderosa pine in the late summer and early autumn. Because time was always short, this wood was green, meaning it was freshly cut and completely unseasoned. A freshly felled oak log is a sponge. It contains up to 50% moisture content by weight. When traditional settlers stacked this green wood in an outdoor pile, covered it with a canvas tarp, or built a flimsy, uninsulated lean-to shed 20 yards from their cabin, they were setting a thermodynamic trap for themselves. As the Dakota winter sets in, outdoor temperatures regularly plunge below 0 degrees. The moisture trapped inside those stacked logs literally freezes, expanding the cellular structure of the wood and encasing the logs in microscopic ice. When a blizzard strikes, dropping 3 feet of snow, the outdoor woodshed becomes a frozen tomb. The settler is then forced to wade through waist-deep snowdrifts, expending precious physical calories, only to drag frozen, wet logs back into the cabin. And here is where the physics become deadly. When you place a frozen green log into a cast iron stove, it does not immediately produce heat. Before the wood fiber can actually combust and release its trapped solar energy, the fire must first boil away the internal water. The transition of liquid water to vapor requires a massive amount of energy, a phenomenon known in thermodynamics as the latent heat of vaporization. Burning wet wood consumes up to 30% of its own potential British thermal units, BTUs, just to dry itself out inside the firebox. Instead of radiating a warm, life-saving 75 degrees into the room, the stove hisses. It drops the internal cabin temperature. It produces a thick, acrid black smoke heavy with creosote, which coats the inside of the chimney pipe, drastically increasing the risk of a catastrophic flue fire. The conventional method was inefficient, exhausting, and incredibly dangerous. Elara, having watched her husband shiver to death in a damp room, refused to repeat the mistakes of her neighbors. Elara was an immigrant, born in the rugged, wind-battered peat bogs of the Scottish Highlands. She came from a long line of crofters who survived centuries of brutal maritime winters, not by fighting the landscape, but by sinking into it. She remembered the ancestral black houses of her youth, structures built with massive double-walled dry stone, integrated animal quarters, and a profound understanding of thermal mass. She couldn't build a black house in the Dakotas. She didn't have the stone. But she understood the underlying principles of vernacular engineering. She knew that beneath the frost line, which in the Dakota Territory sits roughly 42 inches below the surface, the Earth maintains a constant, stable geothermal temperature of roughly 50 degree Celsius to 55 degree Celsius, regardless of whether there is a raging blizzard or a scorching heat wave above ground. Elara looked at her remaining 18 or 65. She looked at the massive pile of green, wet cottonwood logs she had managed to barter from a passing logger in exchange for mending his canvas tents. If she stacked that wood outside, it would freeze. If she brought it inside, it would take up half her living space and introduce mold and dampness into the cabin, rotting the pine floorboards from the top down. Then, the radical, counterintuitive idea struck her. She wouldn't build a woodshed out in the yard. She wouldn't stack the wood under a tarp. She would excavate a deep, subterranean vault directly beneath the footprint of her cabin. She would place the green wood inside the earth itself. But she wouldn't just bury it. She would engineer a passive, geothermal kiln. She would use the constant 50-degree Celsius heat of the deep earth to keep the wood from freezing, and she would harness the waste heat from her own cabin floor to draw the moisture out of the logs, drying them rapidly while the winter raged outside. She would never have to step foot in the snow to feed her fire. It was a brilliant, highly technical concept. It relied on convection currents, moisture management, and precise drainage pitches. It was also an idea so bizarre to the traditional American frontiersmen that they openly mocked her sanity. But Elara kept digging. The wind was picking up, and the first flakes of the season were only weeks away. If you are the kind of person who values practical wisdom over popular opinion, subscribe to help preserve these frontier techniques. Also, comment below, which city are you watching from? By October 28, 1887, Elara's excavation was complete. The rectangular void in the earth measured precisely 12 feet by 14 feet, centered perfectly within the planned 14 by 16-foot footprint of her cabin. She had dug down an exhausting 6 feet. The depth was not arbitrary, it was a calculation rooted in the rigid laws of thermodynamics. In the Dakota Territory, the winter frost line, the maximum depth to which groundwater and soil is expected to freeze, plunges to roughly 42 inches. Anything above that line is subject to the violent expansion and contraction of freezing moisture, a force strong enough to heave solid granite foundation stones out of alignment. By digging 72 inches deep, Elara had bypassed the frost line entirely. She had tapped into the Earth's thermal battery. Down there, the ambient temperature of the soil remained a constant, unyielding 50 degree to 55 degree, completely insulated from the sub-zero atmospheric chaos above. But a hole in the ground is, by definition, a trap for water. To prevent her subterranean chamber from becoming a stagnant, muddy swimming pool during the spring thaw or a heavy autumn rain, Elara engineered a gravity-fed drainage system. Using her hickory spade, she carved a precise 2-degree drainage pitch into the clay floor, sloping it toward the lowest corner of the pit. There, she dug a deeper, 3-foot cylindrical sump hole, filling it entirely with coarse river gravel and permeable sand, a rudimentary soakaway that utilized capillary action to disperse any intruding hydrostatic pressure deep into the bedrock. Next came the walls. Elara spent 5 grueling days driving her borrowed wagon to a nearby dry creek bed, loading it with smooth, heavy fieldstones. She dry-stacked these stones against the dirt walls of her trench without mortar, relying on gravity and friction for structural integrity. These stones were not merely retaining walls, they were thermal mass. Dense materials like stone possess high specific heat capacity. They would absorb the steady 50-degree geothermal energy from the earth and slowly radiate it into the center of the room, creating a phenomenon known as thermal lag, stabilizing the microclimate inside the pit. Across the top of this stone-lined vault, Elara laid her floor framing. Because she could not afford premium lumber, she used rough-sawn, green hemlock, setting the heavy 2x6 joists at a strict 16-inch spacing to support the immense dead load of the cast-iron stove she planned to install above. What Elara was building was not a basement. It was not a simple storage cellar. It was an active, passive draft thermal kiln designed to strip the moisture from 70 cords of green cottonwood. To achieve this, she had to master moisture management and airflow. Wood dries through the evaporation of bound water within its cellular structure, a process dictated entirely by relative humidity and air circulation. If Elara simply sealed the wet wood in the hole and nailed the floorboards shut over it, the trapped moisture would quickly reach its dew point, the temperature at which air can no longer hold all its water vapor. Condensation would form on the underside of her floorboards, breeding black mold, cultivating dry rot, and destroying her home from the ground up within a single season. To prevent this, Elara engineered a convection loop using the stack effect. In opposite corners of the cabin's floor plan, she intentionally left 2 6-inch gaps in the floorboards. In the northwest corner, the windward side, she installed an intake vent, dropping a salvaged length of 3-inch tin stovepipe down to the bottom of the stone vault. In the southeast corner, directly behind where her cast-iron heating stove would sit, she installed an exhaust vent that ran up the cabin wall and out through the roof line. The physics were elegantly simple, yet profoundly effective. When winter arrived and Elara fired up her cast-iron stove, the radiant heat would warm the floorboards directly above the subterranean wood supply. Heat naturally rises. As the warmed air inside the cabin and the exhaust pipe rose and escaped through the roof vent, it created a slight negative pressure, a vacuum, inside the subfloor kiln. This vacuum actively pulled freezing, bone-dry winter air from outside down through the intake pipe. As this dense, dry air hit the bottom of the 50-degree vault, it warmed slightly, expanding its capacity to hold moisture. It swept across the stacks of green cottonwood, absorbing the evaporating water. Warmed further by the ambient heat bleeding down from the floorboards above, this moisture-laden air became buoyant, rising naturally up the exhaust stack and venting safely out into the Dakota sky. It was a perpetual, self-sustaining dehydration engine, powered entirely by waste heat and the Earth's geothermal stability. By the time January arrived, her green wood would be transformed into highly efficient bone-dry fuel, and her floorboards would remain perfectly sound. Innovation on the frontier, however, was rarely met with applause. It was met with suspicion, mockery, and the rigid dogmatism of men who believed traditional suffering was a badge of honor. Jebediah Cross was a 48-year-old master carpenter originally from Ohio. He was a man of the square and the level, deeply entrenched in conventional building practices. When he rode past Elara's lot on a cold November morning and saw her installing floor joists over a pit of unseasoned firewood, he halted his horse in sheer disbelief. "You are a foolish woman, Mrs. Sterling," Jebediah announced, his voice carrying the heavy, authoritative timbre of a man used to being obeyed. He dismounted and walked to the edge of the foundation, kicking a stray clump of clay into the vault. "Moisture rises. It is a law of God and nature. You are trapping 50 gallons of water beneath your living space. You're building a rot box. Those hemlock joists will be black with mildew by Christmas, and your floor will collapse under the weight of your own stove. Fill it in before you kill yourself." Elara wiped the sweat from her forehead, her hands calloused and raw. "The draft will carry the moisture out the roof vent, Mr. Cross. The earth will keep it from freezing." Jebediah laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Air doesn't flow through a hole in the ground, widow. Physics is physics." "Exactly," Elara murmured, turning back to her hammer. Later that week, Elias Vance, a 52-year-old cattle baron whose sprawling ranch dominated the northern ridge, stopped his polished buggy to observe the spectacle. Vance was a man of substantial means. He had just finished constructing a dedicated, detached woodshed measuring 10 by 20 feet, built from kiln-dried eastern pine, heavily roofed, and stocked with premium, seasoned oak and imported anthracite coal. The materials alone had cost him an exorbitant $150. "I admire your grit, Mrs. Sterling, I truly do," Vance said, leaning over the dashboard of his buggy, his tone dripping with patronizing pity. "But pride does not burn in a stove. When that hole of yours fills with snowmelt and your wood is encased in solid ice, you will freeze. When that happens, you may walk up to my ranch. You can warm your hands by my coal stove, but you will bring your pride with you and you will admit this was a fool's errand." "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Vance," Elara replied evenly, driving a square-cut iron nail into a joist with 2 precise ringing blows. "But my wood will be dry." The skepticism was not limited to the men. Mrs. Martha Gable, the 60-year-old proprietor of the local mercantile, dealt the harshest blow of all. Elara needed 3 sheets of corrugated iron to properly flash the roofline around her exhaust vent to ensure a watertight seal. The cost was $420. Elara, having spent her remaining funds on nails, hinges, and food staples, asked for a brief extension of credit. Mrs. Gable, standing behind her polished oak counter, slowly shook her head. "I cannot do it, Elara. I cannot in good conscience lend $420 for roofing iron when you are actively ruining the foundation of your home. The bank will seize that property by spring when your floor rots out, and I will never see my money. It is bad business. You should have built a proper lean-to like everyone else." Elara left the mercantile empty-handed. She returned to her cabin and fabricated improvised roof, flashing out of flattened tin cans and pine pitch. It was ugly, but it was waterproof. By the first week of December 1887, the landscape of Spearfish Valley had transformed into a stark, unforgiving expanse of gray and white. The preparations of the settlers were fully visible. At the Cross homestead, Jebediah had a massive, impressive cord of wood stacked 20 feet from his door, covered tightly in heavy canvas tarpaulins to protect it from the snow. At the Vance Ranch, the $150 woodshed stood proud and tall, a monument to wealth and conventional planning. Elara's lot, by contrast, looked completely unprepared. Aside from her small, low-profile 14 by 16 cabin, there was nothing. No lean-to, no canvas-covered mounds, no outbuildings. Just the aerodynamic, slightly pitched roof of her home, the tin chimney of her stove, and the odd, secondary exhaust vent protruding from the rear corner. Inside her cabin, however, a subtle magic was occurring. Right beside her cast-iron stove, set flush into the floorboards, was a heavy wooden trapdoor with a recessed iron ring. When she lifted it, a wave of dry, 55-degree air drifted up from the darkness. Below, neatly stacked in the subterranean vault, was her winter survival. The continuous draft, powered by the heat of her daily cooking fires, had been silently working for weeks. The heavy green cottonwood logs were already shedding their water weight, their bark peeling back as the fibers shrank and hardened. The skeptics had laughed. They had placed their faith in canvas, distance, and traditional architecture. But nature doesn't care about tradition. The sky above the Black Hills was turning a bruised, violent shade of purple. The barometer was beginning a slow, terrifying descent. The true test of Elara's vernacular engineering was not going to be a standard winter storm. It was going to be a meteorological anomaly that would scar the history of the Dakota Territory forever. The morning of January 12, 1888 began with a cruel, atmospheric lie. Across the Dakota Territory, the sun rose to reveal a strangely balmy, thawing landscape. By 10:00 a.m., the ambient temperature in Spearfish Valley had climbed to an unseasonable 34 degrees. The heavy packed snow from December's flurries began to melt, turning the wagon ruts into a slurry of freezing mud. Settlers, lulled into a false sense of security by the sudden warmth, unbuttoned their heavy woolen coats. Children were sent to the distant one-room schoolhouses without their heavy furs. But the barometer inside the Deadwood Telegraph office was telling a terrifying story. The needle was plummeting at a rate rarely recorded in human history. A massive, violently cold mass of Arctic air, heavy and dense, was sweeping down from the Canadian plains, traveling at highway speeds. It was about to violently collide with the warm, moisture-laden air hovering over the Dakotas. Nature does not negotiate, and physics is the only judge that matters. At exactly 2:15 p.m., the horizon to the northwest turned the color of bruised iron. A distinct, terrifying roar echoed across the prairie, the sound of millions of tons of atmospheric pressure equalizing. Within 20 minutes, the temperature in Spearfish Valley catastrophic dropped from 34 degrees to a lethal 7 degrees. The wind rapidly accelerated, transforming into 60-mile-per-hour gusts that sheared the tops off the prairie grass. The air was instantly saturated with a blinding, pulverized snow that did not fall from the sky, but was driven horizontally by the gale. It was a whiteout so absolute that a man could not see his own outstretched hand. This was the children's blizzard, a storm of such sudden, devastating ferocity that it would etch a permanent scar into the history of the American West. At the Cross homestead, the brutal arithmetic of the frontier was about to collect its debt. By 4 p.m., the temperature had crashed further to 18 degrees. Inside his conventionally built timber frame cabin, Jebediah Cross realized the fire in his cast-iron stove was burning low. He needed wood. He donned his heavy buffalo coat and pushed open his front door. The wind immediately ripped it from his grasp, slamming it against the exterior wall and instantly sucking the ambient heat out of his living space. Jebediah fought his way into the blinding white maelstrom, taking 20 agonizing steps toward the massive cord of green oak he had so proudly stacked in the autumn. When he reached it, a grim reality set in. The heavy canvas tarpaulin he had used to cover the wood was no longer a flexible sheet of fabric. The morning's freezing rain, followed by the sudden temperature drop, had turned the canvas into a rigid, impenetrable dome of solid ice. Desperate, Jebediah used a splitting maul to shatter the frozen canvas, exposing the wood beneath. But the green oak logs, which naturally contained 45% moisture content by weight, had also frozen solid. The moisture inside the cellular structure of the wood had expanded as it turned to ice, locking the logs together in a formidable, heavy block. Panting, his lungs burning from the sub-zero air, Jebediah managed to pry 5 heavy, ice-encased logs loose. He dragged them back to the cabin, kicking the door shut behind him. He had survived the trip outside, but he had doomed his home. When Jebediah threw the frozen, wet oak into his stove, the thermodynamic trap snapped shut. The firebox, which had been resting at a modest 400-degree ice, was suddenly inundated with frozen water. The physics of latent heat of vaporization demanded their toll. Before the wood could combust and release its life-saving BTUs, the existing fire had to expend massive amounts of energy just to boil the ice into steam. The cabin's internal temperature plummeted from 55-degree Celsius to 35-degree Celsius in a matter of minutes. The stove began to hiss violently. Because the fire was robbed of its heat, the combustion became incomplete. Thick, acrid black smoke poured from the iron seams of the stove door, filling the room with noxious carbon monoxide and depositing a heavy, highly combustible layer of sticky creosote up the entire length of his chimney flue. He was burning his fuel, yet growing colder by the minute. He huddled in a chair, coughing violently, wrapped in every quilt he owned, watching his breath turn to vapor in his own living room. 2 miles north, Elias Vance, the wealthy rancher who had mocked Elara's foolishness, was learning a harsh lesson in aerodynamics. By 8 p.m., the wind chill had reached an unfathomable 41 degrees. Vance's grand, $150 woodshed, built 20 yards from his back door, had become an unintentional snow fence. The sheer, flat wall of the shed caused the 60 mph winds to suddenly decelerate on its leeward side, dropping all their suspended snow in one concentrated area. A massive, impenetrable 12-foot snowdrift had formed directly over the door to the woodshed. The heavy iron hinges were buried beneath tons of compacted, wind-driven snow. Vance, a man of substantial means, was literally walled off from his premium, seasoned pine, and expensive imported anthracite coal. The conventional separation of fuel and dwelling had failed entirely. Trapped inside his freezing mansion, Vance was reduced to taking an axe to his own expensive imported mahogany dining chairs just to keep the frostbite at bay. His wealth meant absolutely nothing in the face of the storm. 3 miles down the valley, the wind howled like a wounded animal against the walls of Elara Sterling's modest 14-16-foot cabin. The snow load on her roof was increasing, but the aerodynamic, low-profile pitch she had designed easily shed the worst of the drifts, deflecting the howling gale over the top of the structure rather than allowing it to batter the broadside walls. Inside, the atmosphere was a stark, almost unbelievable contrast to the suffering of her neighbors. At 10 p.m., Elara sat in her rocking chair sipping a cup of hot chicory coffee. The ambient air temperature in her cabin was a stable, luxurious 68 degrees. She wore only a simple woolen dress, her heavy coat discarded on the bed. When the fire in her cast-iron stove began to wane, she did not put on her boots. She did not open her front door to the 41 Mustang wind chill, instantly losing all her hard-earned indoor heat. She simply stood up, walked 2 paces to the side of the stove, and grasped the recessed iron ring of her heavy wooden trapdoor. She hoisted the heavy door upward, and immediately, a gentle, dry updraft kissed her face. Beneath the floorboards, the thermal mass of her carefully stacked fieldstones had done their job flawlessly. The deep earth surrounding the trench continued to radiate its constant 55-degree past geothermal heat, completely insulating the subterranean vault from the apocalyptic freeze occurring just 6 feet above. The convection loop she had engineered back in October was operating at peak efficiency. For months, the waste heat radiating down from her floorboards had pulled dry, cold air through the intake pipe, sweeping it over the wood, absorbing the evaporating water, and carrying the moisture up and out the dedicated exhaust vent. Elara climbed 2 steps down the short wooden ladder into the vault. The smell was intoxicating, the rich, dry, earthy scent of perfectly seasoned timber. The heavy green cottonwood logs she had scavenged in the autumn were transformed. Their bark was loose, their weight lightened by half. Through the relentless, passive power of constant airflow and thermal lag, the moisture content of the wood had been driven down from a waterlogged 50% to a highly combustible 15%. She selected 4 lightweight, bone-dry logs, carried them up the 2 steps, and dropped the trapdoor flush with the floor, instantly sealing the cabin again. She hadn't lost a single degree of ambient heat in the process. When she tossed the dry cottonwood into the stove, the result was instantaneous. Because there was no internal water to boil away, the wood ignited with a fierce, bright orange roar. The fire immediately converted the wood fiber into pure, radiant BTUs. The stovepipe ticked and pinged as the metal expanded, radiating waves of life-saving heat outward. The glass window of the stove remained perfectly clear, untainted by the black creosote that was currently choking the flues of her skeptics. She had beaten the brutal arithmetic. Her vernacular engineering had turned a fatal flaw of frontier survival into a self-sustaining engine of comfort. By midnight on January 13th, the blizzard had reached its terrifying crescendo. The roaring wind sounded like a continuous freight train passing directly over the valley. Inside Jebediah Cross's cabin, the situation had transitioned from miserable to fatal. His stove had gone entirely cold. The wet oak had simply smothered the coals, hissing its last breath an hour ago. The temperature inside his home had dropped to 15-degree hours. The condensation from his breath and the steam from the wet wood had reached its dew point, freezing solidly against the interior walls of his cabin in a shimmering, ghostly layer of frost. Jebediah's fingers were numb, his core temperature dropping dangerously low. Hypothermia, the silent, creeping executioner of the plains, was beginning to cloud his judgment. He knew that if he fell asleep in that chair, he would never wake up. He had to move. He had to find heat. The closest structure to his homestead was not the town, which was 3 miles away. It was the small 14-16-foot cabin of the widow Sterling, sitting just a quarter-mile across the adjacent ridge. Swallowing the last jagged remnants of his pride, Jebediah wrapped 3 thick wool blankets around his shoulders, tied a length of rope around his waist, and secured the other end to his heavy iron bed frame, a standard precaution to ensure he could find his way back if he missed his mark. He forced the front door open, stepping out into the lethal, screaming void. The cold was a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs. He could not see. He could only navigate by feel, blindly following the rigid line of his split-rail fence that ran toward the property line. For 40 agonizing minutes, he fought through waist-deep drifts, his legs burning with lactic acid, the ice sealing his eyelashes shut. Just as his strength began to definitively fail, just as his knees buckled, and the insidious, warm lethargy of freezing to death began to whisper in his ear, he saw it. A faint amber glow cutting through the blinding white fury. It was the steady, rhythmic pulse of sparks rising from a tin chimney. It wasn't the thick, choking black smoke of wet wood. It was the clean, hot exhaust of a perfectly drafted high-temperature fire. Jebediah stumbled forward, falling against the solid, unyielding timber walls of Elara's cabin. He raised a heavy, frost-bitten fist and weakly pounded on the thick oak door, praying to a god he hoped was listening, that the foolish widow he had mocked had somehow managed to survive the night. When Elara Sterling unlatched her heavy oak door in the pitch black of the early morning hours, the sheer, violent force of the blizzard nearly tore the heavy timber from its iron hinges. Standing in the threshold, illuminated only by the warm, amber glow of the cast-iron stove behind her, was the frozen, wretched form of Jebediah Cross. He was entirely unrecognizable. His heavy buffalo coat was a solid armor of white ice. His face was a mask of frost, his lips cracked and bleeding, his breathing shallow and rapid, the hallmark signs of late-stage hypothermia. Elara did not hesitate. She grabbed the collar of his coat, using her own body weight to drag the master carpenter out of the lethal 41 yard void and into the sanctuary of her cabin. She slammed the door shut, throwing the heavy iron bolt into place, instantly cutting off the screaming roar of the storm. For Jebediah, the transition was a violent thermodynamic shock. To step from a wind chill that was actively destroying his cellular tissue into an ambient room temperature of 68 degrees Celsius was an agonizing experience. As the blood rushed back into his extremities, his capillaries dilated rapidly, bringing a wave of intense, burning pain to his hands and face. He collapsed onto Elara's woven rug, unable to speak, his teeth chattering with concussive force. Elara methodically stripped away his frozen outer layers. She did not offer pity, nor did she offer a lecture on his previous arrogance. The brutal arithmetic of the frontier had already made its point. She simply poured him a mug of boiling chicory coffee, wrapped him in a dry woolen blanket, and turned her attention back to the fire. As Jebediah sat trembling on the floor, the ice melting from his beard, his glazed eyes tracked her movements. He watched as Elara walked to the center of the room. He watched as she reached down and grasped the recessed iron ring of the trapdoor. When she lifted it, Jebediah braced himself for the blast of freezing, damp air that his conventional building experience told him must exist in that subterranean pit. He expected the smell of black mold and the sharp bite of winter. Instead, what drifted up from the darkness was a warm, incredibly dry draft, carrying the rich, seasoned scent of kiln-dried cottonwood. Elara reached down into the 55-degree thermal battery she had engineered, pulled up 3 perfectly descaled feather-light logs, and tossed them into the stove. They caught fire instantly, releasing a massive burst of BTUs into the room without a single hiss of evaporating moisture. Jebediah stared at the trapdoor. He looked at the floor joists, visible in the flickering light. They were pale, dry, and perfectly sound. There was no rot. There was no condensation. "The draft," Jebediah croaked, his voice raw and broken. It was not a question. It was the profound realization of a man whose entire world view had just been dismantled by a widow with a spade. The cold air falls, it sweeps the moisture, and the heat carries it out the roof. "Physics, Mr. Cross," Elara replied softly, closing the trapdoor. "It is the only judge that matters." The children's blizzard finally broke on the morning of January 14th, 1888. When the sun finally pierced the heavy gray cloud cover, it revealed a landscape fundamentally altered. Spearfish Valley was buried under drifting dunes of snow that reached 15 feet in height, swallowing fences, wagons, and entire herds of cattle. The human toll across the Dakota Territory was catastrophic. But in this small corner of the valley, survival had been dictated strictly by preparation and engineering. Elias Vance, the wealthy rancher who had boasted of his $150 woodshed, survived the storm, but at a terrible, humiliating cost. Trapped inside his freezing home, cut off from his fuel by a massive snowdrift, Vance had been forced to burn his imported mahogany dining table, his parlor chairs, and finally, his children's wooden toys, just to keep the internal temperature above freezing. Despite his desperate efforts, he suffered severe frostbite on his left foot, resulting in a permanent, agonizing limp. His wealth had been entirely insulated from reality, and reality had broken in. 2 days later, when the roads became passable, a small, humbled contingent of neighbors, led by a recovering Jebediah Cross, arrived at Elara's property. They had come to check on the widow they were certain had perished. Instead, they found Elara sweeping her front step, smoke drafting cleanly from her chimney, her cabin an oasis of radiant warmth. Jebediah asked for permission to inspect the subfloor kiln. Elara obliged. The master carpenter climbed down the ladder into the subterranean vault. He ran his calloused, bandaged hands over the dry-stacked fieldstone walls. He marveled at the ambient 50-degree F geothermal heat that seemed to radiate from the very earth itself. He inspected the hemlock floor joists above his head, searching desperately for the black mold he had guaranteed would be there. They were bone dry. The moisture had been perfectly managed, kept below the dew point by the constant, passive convection current of the intake and exhaust vents. "I was wrong, Mrs. Sterling," Jebediah admitted, standing in the center of her makeshift kiln. "I built my home to fight the winter. You built yours to use it." By the following summer, the architectural landscape of Spearfish Valley began to quietly change. You would not see grand detached woodsheds being erected. Instead, you saw men like Jebediah Cross digging deep, stone-lined trenches beneath their new additions. You saw the subtle installation of floor vents and secondary exhaust stacks. Elara's method of the subfloor thermal kiln became a quiet standard, a piece of vernacular engineering passed down not through textbooks, but through the undeniable proof of survival. What Elara Sterling accomplished in 1887 was not merely a clever trick of frontier survival. It was a foundational application of what modern architects and engineers now refer to as earth-sheltering and passive house principles. Today we spend billions of dollars on complex HVAC systems, forced air heating, and electrical dehumidifiers. Yet the foundational physics Elara utilized remain the gold standard for hyper-efficient, sustainable architecture. Modern earth-sheltered homes utilize the exact same thermal mass principles. By sinking a structure below the frost line, modern engineers tap into the Earth's infinite capacity to store and regulate temperature, drastically reducing the BTUs required to heat a space in the winter or cool it in the summer. Furthermore, Elara's ingenious method of using the cabin's waste heat to drive a continuous draft to dry her wood and manage moisture is the direct 19th century ancestor of the modern heat recovery ventilator, HRV. In a modern passive house, the thermal envelope is sealed tight, but a continuous, engineered flow of air is passed through a heat exchanger, using the outgoing warm air to temper the incoming cold air, precisely managing indoor humidity and preventing rot without wasting energy. Elara didn't have a computerized HRV system. She had a tin pipe, the thermal lag of fieldstone, and a profound, intuitive understanding of convection currents. She understood that a house is not just a shelter, it is an active thermodynamic machine. Elara Sterling did not lose her claim. When the spring thaw arrived in May of 1888, she walked into the Territorial Land Office and proved up her 160 acres. She walked into the local bank and paid off the 1865 lien against her draft horse, severing her final chain of debt. She had beaten the weather, she had beaten the bank, and she had out-engineered the men who had laughed at her. She lived on that same plot of land for another 36 years. She expanded the cabin, built a proper barn, and became a quiet, fiercely respected matriarch of Spearfish Valley. The neighbors who had once mocked her came to her for advice when their wells ran dry or their foundations settled. She never turned them away, but she never let them forget the lessons of the earth either. Elara passed away peacefully in her sleep on November 14, 1924, at the age of 71. The ledger of her life was closed, but her legacy remained permanently embedded in the soil of the Dakotas. She was not remembered as a wealthy baron or a famous politician. She was remembered as the sage of the valley, the vernacular engineer who taught a community that true survival requires yielding to the laws of nature rather than fighting them. The frontier does not care about your pride. It does not grade on a curve, but it will always eventually yield to those who take the time to listen to the silent, unyielding laws of physics. If you found value in this story, hit that like button to help others find these stories of creativity. Subscribe to preserve this knowledge.